In the first major section of the book, Peter discussed salvation, and he looked at it from a number of angles. From God's perspective, our perspective, the greatness of salvation, the implications of salvation for our behavior, and then he looked at our salvation theologically. Then, in chapter 2, verse 11, he began the next major section of the book, namely talking about living righteous lives regardless of the situation or circumstances we face. And he began by giving instructions, as we discussed in the last lecture, first to all believers, and then he started selecting groups within the church. He gave instructions to servants and instructions to wives. Now he continues, beginning in chapter 3, verse 7, with this strategy. He will be talking then to husbands, and then going back to give final instructions for all believers in the church. So his instructions to husband are found in chapter 3, verse 7, where he says, "Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Now, the specific context here, as in his previous instructions, was the instruction in chapter 2, verse 13, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution." Now, he then uses participles for talking to servants, wives, and now husbands. So actually it was servants. The translation that I have says, "Be subject to your masters." It's actually a participle, being subject. Wives, being subject to your husbands, and husbands living with your wives in an understanding way. Now, those three participles actually have an imperatival force. In other words, they are essentially commands, but they are in participle form. But they draw their imperatival force from the verb be subject in chapter 2, verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And now he's giving examples of that for different people. Now, verse 7 begins the word likewise. Well, likewise renders the responsibilities of husband and wife reciprocal. And so, for example, just as the instructions to the wife, be subject, is given only to the wife, the husband is not told to make your wife be submissive, or you make sure that she is, because that is ultimately her responsibility to God. And in the same way, the responsibility on the husband's part to live with your wife in an understanding way and honor her simply because she is a woman and an heir of life with you, and so that your prayers will not be hindered, that is given only to the husband. In other words, the wife is not told, you make sure your husband treats you well, loves you, respects you, and so on and so forth. Because ultimately, as a husband, that is my responsibility ultimately to God. So the responsibilities, you might say, of both husband and wife are relativized by the corresponding responsibility to the other. So in other words, the wife's responsibility in being subject to her husband is relativized by the responsibilities on the husband, and vice versa. But as a practical matter, I think Scott McKnight is absolutely correct when he says that two things. Number one, what submission means can only be understood by asking the question what love means. In other words, in Ephesians 5, corresponding set of instructions Paul gives, he tells husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Here Peter says, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to your wife. So her responsibility to you is relativized by the responsibility of the husband. So we need to ask, what does love mean? What does living in an understanding way mean? What does honoring her mean? McKnight goes on to say that the whole submission issue, my wife is not submitting, ultimately, he says, invariably has a controlling husband at its root. And I think that is true in the vast majority of cases. Because if you think about it, if the Christian wife is striving to love her husband, and the husband is seeking to love his wife with his whole being, the issue of submission is never going to come up. You see, the focus of biblical marriage is on loving and serving the other, not demanding your own ways. It's putting the other first. If the husband does that, there's never going to be an issue of, he's never going to face the issue of, my wife isn't following me, obeying me, submitting to me. No, because you're treating her so well. She will follow you to hell and back because she loves you, because she knows you love her because of the way you treat her. Why can't husbands get that through their thick skulls, it seems to me? Because husbands often resort to demanding submission when they're trying to get their own way. Well, that's a self-centered attitude. The husband should be asking himself, why do I have to use force to get this done? You see, that is not a Christian way of relating to your spouse. And think about this, husbands, as the, quote, dominant, end quote, partner. Your responsibility and therefore your accountability to God and the judgment you face are greater than those of your wives. Husbands, when it says husbands, live with your wife in an understanding way, the most basic meaning of this is live with your wives. So many husbands spend all their time, and this happens, by the way, with a lot of church leaders. Husbands spend all their time at the office or at the church or off on evangelistic missions or so on and so forth. That's not biblical. Yes, there are times when you have to be away. But look at Peter. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, Peter took his wife with him when he was off on an evangelistic mission. He did not abandon his family. And so many church leaders, they do that. They think, God, look what I'm sacrificing for you. And they're expecting God to bless them because they're spending all of their time away from their wife and their children. And I think God is saying, you think you're going to be blessed. You are storing up judgment for yourself because you have been called to marriage. And, in fact, 1 Timothy 3 gives 15 requirements to be a leader in the church. 2 of them relate to marriage and the family. If you're married and you're a man, you need to be what Paul calls a one-woman man. In other words, you're united with your wife. You're one with her, as it says in Genesis chapter 2. You don't have a girlfriend on the side. You're not fantasizing about somebody else. You and your wife are one. And you need to have a good home life. Because what Paul is saying in 1 Timothy 3 is, if you do not have a marriage and family like that, you're no longer qualified to be a leader in the church. You need to step down. You need to get your marriage and your family life into proper order. It's that important. How many men do that? Not a lot, because that reveals that their job is more important to them than their marriage. It should be the other way around, because to have a solid, loving marriage of oneness is a qualifying requirement, even to be a leader in the church. But when it says in an understanding way, I mean, the Greek phrase literally means according to knowledge. The knowledge, first, of course, relates to knowledge of God and Jesus Christ, but because only by having that kind of a relationship can you rightly understand the nature of men and women, the significance of marriage, and can rightly order your life. But you need to know your wife. What is she like? What does she dislike? What are her strengths? What are her weaknesses? And so on, so that you can relate to her. Because think about it. She is to be the closest, most intimate lover, friend, mate that you will ever have your entire life. Remember, you took vows to be married for life. And what the vows may have said, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So you're going to be with her forever on this earth. And therefore, there's going to come a time when you'll lose your job, you'll retire, whatever, and then you're going to be with this spouse for another 20 years or more. That's why you need to spend the time now to get so close that it will be a great blessing. But Peter then goes on to say, husbands should be showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since she is a woman, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. Now, what he is saying is that the mere fact that she is female, the mere fact that she is a woman and is therefore different from you, is reason in and of itself to honor her. Now, women tend to be physically weaker. And a lot of men, again, they don't understand this. They think, me man, me strong, woman weak. Well, and so you think you're superior to her. Well, what Peter is saying is, no, the mere fact that she may be weaker is reason enough to honor her. It's kind of like this. Think of a fine china teacup and a tin cup. Now, the fine china teacup, if you drop it on the floor, it will shatter. The tin cup will not. But the fine china teacup is vastly more valuable than a tin cup because it is weaker. That's the way you need to look at your wife and at women. And it's very interesting. It is true. Men, in general, tend to be bigger, tend to weigh more, tend to have greater upper body strength. But if you think about it, you may not know this. Women tend to have a much more acute sense of smell. They can detect smells that men cannot. They have a much more acute sense of hearing. Women, although they tend to be smaller, have the same number of brain cells as men have, but they're packed together tighter, which means there's greater interaction between the two hemispheres of the brain, which indicates that women tend to be able to read people, their faces, their body language, better than men can do that. In our Ecclesia book on biblical marriage and parenting, we have a chapter, it's chapter 2, that talks about men and women and the image of God, and we discuss a lot of these fascinating physical, chemical, and other differences, neurological differences between men and women. I think you ought to read that because it will help disabuse you of the notion that men are up here, women down there. Because Peter himself goes on to say, the other reason why we need to honor our wives is because she is an heir with you of the grace of life. In other words, God has honored her, woman, your wife, equally with you. The wife has the same promises and benefits of being a member of Christ's body and family as you do. God has chosen and honored the wife on exactly the same basis that he has chosen and honored the husband. And therefore, the husband must honor the wife too, because if you don't, you will be dishonoring what God honors. Peter ends his instructions to the husband by giving another very important reason why they need to honor their wives, so that your prayers may not be hindered. You see, how you treat your wife is a sign of and affects, either positively or negatively, your own relationship with God and your own spiritual development. Now, some writers think that the so that your prayers may not be hindered relates equally to both wives and husbands, since they are a unit. But I think that in the structure of the sentence, he's clearly talking to men here. So regardless of that, however, that phrase, so that your prayers will not be hindered, I think again demonstrates the spiritual nature of marriage. Marriage is a calling. Yes, if you're single and celibate, that is a calling. But if you are married, that is a calling. And as I already discussed from 1 Timothy 3, your relationship with your spouse is a foundational requirement if you're even going to be or remain a leader in the church. So we need to take time and develop and maintain good marriages, because that's God's will. It's serving God. It's a spiritual activity. And since marriage is spiritual, there are implications of this. Think about it. Marriage is very high in God's views, because marriage is built into the creation order, according to Genesis 2. Because marriage is built into the creation order, it is an institution of great value. And it's part of what God called very good at the end of creation. Because it is of great value to God, we must value our own marriage relationship as being supreme of all of our other relationships. According to Ephesians 5, marriage is a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his church. And because of that, marriage at root is spiritual. And also because of the fact that marriage reflects the relationship between Christ and his church, how we treat our spouse and our relationship with our spouse really is a reflection of what we think of Christ and what we think of the church. And also, I think because marriage is so important, and it is spiritual, we can expect to see practical outworkings either of God's chastisement or of his blessing in our lives, depending upon how we treat our spouse. And I would also add that at root, I think, the closeness and intimacy of marriage. Remember, Genesis 2 says, the two are one. It is a little reflection of the fact that the ultimate basis for marriage is the intimate love and union between the members of the Trinity itself. Marriage has a high view in God's eyes, and it should have just as high a view in our eyes, and we need to spend the time getting our marriages in wonderful order, because if you've got a great relationship of your wife and you come home, it's like an oasis in the desert out there. You won't find that anywhere else. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, I've been married for over 40 years. We've always had a good marriage, but in the last, 15 years or so, I think our marriage is better than ever. And as we put Christ first, that has effects in how you treat your spouse. And I'll tell you, there's nothing like it. Take the time, spend the time to get your marriages in order. And by the way, in, again, our Ecclesia book on biblical marriage and parenting, we have a lot of tips on how to do that, including what's known as the 5 love languages. So check out that section, and I think you're going to see some tremendous benefits in your marriage. Now, Peter goes on in chapter 3, verses 8 through 12, to again address all believers, kind of summarizing what he's been saying. He began by giving instructions to all believers, then talked about servants, wives, husbands, and now he goes back to all believers. He says this: finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires, and now he's quoting from Psalm 34 in verses 10 through 12, whoever desires to love life and see good days, Let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now, again, he begins this by saying finally, indicating he's summarizing and going back here and making specific applications of the principles he's been talking about. The center of this is verse 9b, where he says, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. This phrase gives us the reason why we should live the way Peter has been talking about, so that we can receive God's blessing. In order to do that, we have to be a blessing to others. That's why God has called us. Now, in verse 8, he gives 5 attitudes that should characterize all believers: unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Now, these are all inner attitudes, but they all have outward manifestations. And that's consistent with what Jesus said when he recognized in Mark 7 that it's the person's inner life, it's their inner self that is the source of our defilement. You see, the Christian life is about changed lives, not merely changed beliefs. Our beliefs really don't matter if they don't affect how we live. So we need to be devoted to Christ and determined to live out the Christian life. Now, Peter heads his list in verse 8 with the word unity of mind. The Greek, it's one word in the Greek, which means being like-minded, united in spirit, harmonious. Now, harmoniousness is mutually enriching. In essence, Peter is calling for unity and oneness that heads the list that should describe all of our relationships. And that's reflecting what Jesus himself said. The night before he died, in John 17, he gave his longest prayer. It's called the high priestly prayer. And what was he praying? He said in John 17, verse 22, that they may be one even as we are one. Think about it. If somebody's going to die, and they know they're going to die, they don't waste their time talking about the weather. They want to say the things to those they care about that are most important. And the same was true with Jesus. His last prayer, because he knew he was going to die the next day, was about us, that we would all be one, even as he and the Father are one. And that's why Peter heads the list with unity of mind. Sympathy goes along with that. Sympathy talks about our feelings more than just simply agreement of mind. He then says brotherly love. Now that's an important concept because it is the language of family. Families care for each other, they take care of each other, they support each other. There is something unique about a family that cannot be duplicated by any other relationship in the world. And therefore it is significant that Christ does not merely save us from our sins. No, the Bible says that he has adopted us into his family. We find that in Romans 8, Galatians 4, and Ephesians 1. The church is a family, and the New Testament repeatedly uses the language of family to describe the church. And in the book, I have all kinds of citations about that. Therefore, since we are a family, Peter is saying we need to treat each other like the beloved members of a good, loving family. He then uses the term a tender heart. That extends the ideas of sympathy and brotherly love by implying actions of a kind motivated by oneness and sympathy. So God's plan for relationships encompasses thought, feeling, and behavior. And he concludes the list by talking about a humble mind. A humble mind does not vaunt itself, seek to dominate others. Rather, it seeks the best welfare of others, just like Jesus, who said, I did not come to be served, but to serve. Now, Peter goes on to show the practical outworking of Christ-honoring attitudes. And this is in stark contrast to the way of the world. The world's plan for relationships is what you might call performance-based. You do your part, I'll do mine. But if you don't, I won't. In other words, acceptance is earned by what you do. Such relationships are doomed to fail because, I don't have the ability to meet unreal expectations, and I'll never know if you've met your end of the bargain. And in performance-based relationships, people tend to focus on the weaknesses of the other person and tend to be disappointed in them when they don't meet my expectations. And so such relationships tend to focus on my rights, my feelings, me. And the result is, as Peter says, it's an evil for evil or reviling for reviling relationship because it's self-centered. It's not Christian. Christ's basis for relationships is grace-based. And that is why, God has saved us by his grace. And that's why when the other person does not meet your expectations, that love, acceptance, and forgiveness can be freely given. So that's why Peter is talking about it's a blessing for insult relationship rather than an insult for insult relationship. What Peter is saying is stop living the way the world lives. Stop living according to the basis that the world orders its relationships under and start living according to how Christ lived and how he orders relationships. Because how we act, especially how we react when we're provoked or insulted or subjected to evil, is the outward and visible sign of whether or not we have the attitudes that Peter mentioned in verse 8. Then he talks about, in verses 10 through 12, basically what giving a blessing looks like. Now, as I said, verses 10 through 12 are all part of a quotation from Psalm 34, verses 12 through 16. In the Old Testament, there was what's known as the family blessing. We see it in Genesis 17, 27, 32, 48, and 49. Generally, a family blessing involved meaningful touch to show the person that you're connected, a spoken message, words of love and acceptance and affirmation, attaching a high value to the person you are blessing, and picturing a special future for him or her, and an active commitment to fulfill that blessing. Now, here in chapter 3 of 1 Peter, Peter says we're to give a blessing. Now, we're not, it may be a little different when you're blessing somebody outside of the family, but giving a blessing is similar, at least, to a family blessing in that it should involve our attitudes, our motives, and our goals. Regarding speech, we're to refrain from speaking evil. Regarding our motives and goals, we're to seek peace and pursue it. Now, pursuit involves work. It involves effort. It's not easy living a life of being a blessing and giving blessings to others, particularly when we face conflict. But the amount of conflict we face will go down as we live a life of blessing others, as we strive for unity and peace, as we have a humble mind. You see, it's going to affect all of our relationships for the better. And so when he concludes in verse 12 by saying, the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, that implies not merely that he sees what you are doing, but that he's looking after the righteous for good, recognizing and meeting their needs. But when Peter says, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, that is clearly a verdict of judgment. Because in Psalm 34, it concludes after saying the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. He goes on to say, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. In short, these verses give us a bold affirmation of the relationship between righteous living and God's present blessings in this life, and it provides a corrective for the careless, half-hearted way that so many Christians live, and a powerful motivation for the kind of holy living to which Peter says all Christians have been called. So let this be our marching orders that can change our marriages, change our relationships for the better. That's what Christ has for us.